This is a Momentum Media production.
The SMSF Advisor Show, your expert insights into the biggest themes shaping the SMSF advice industry.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the SMSF Advisor Show. I'm Miranda Brownlee and I'm joined by my co-host Aaron Dunn. Hi Aaron, how are you?
Very well, Miranda. Yourself?
I'm good. We've got our SMSF Advisor Technical Strategy Day coming up this week. First one in Melbourne this Thursday.
Yes, very much looking forward to it. I have both MC duties and also as a speaker. We've got some great numbers lined up, great speakers lined up, as well as a great number of attendees, which is great to be getting back face-to-face for these events. And I'm sure everyone that's coming along is going to be having a fantastic time.
Yes, it'd be great to have you MC, and we have a wonderful panel of speakers, as you said. So we're really looking forward to seeing everyone in person across those 3 states.
Yeah, and I guess just a quick reminder as well that if you haven't yet registered for maybe the Sydney or the Brisbane event, you can jump online on the SMSF Advisor website and purchase tickets as well. So Miranda, as is always the way, we kick off our SMSF Advisor Show taking a look at what's happening on the legislative front and also what's making news. So I'm going to hand over to you.
Yes, so one of the big news items we had this week was that there was a big SMSF scam which resulted in a raid of a big call centre. So that was actually something happening overseas where they were sort of tricking investors into thinking they were a legitimate company based here in Australia and scamming victims into obtaining their information. And obviously they were targeting superannuation money with that. Yeah,
so I was just going to say, we know that the scamming activity is obviously being heightened quite significantly. And given the nature of the way in which SMSFs are run, given that they are, trustee and member ultimately the same, and it has become an area that continues to get targeted because of the wealth that sits within it. And so this was covered, I guess, fairly extensively this week on the ABC as well. I know I did watch some of that.
Yes.
And it does put a bit of fear of God into you, doesn't it, when you think about the level of sophistication that some of these scams coming into. I know the SMSF Association has done a lot of work, and I know the ATO continues to do a lot of work around awareness of scams and so forth, because we have seen historically, problems and even through collapses of investments and so forth as well that ultimately have left, SMSFs out of pocket and retirement savings disappearing. So, the same levels of protection don't exist in SMSFs as APRA funds. So as an industry, we need to keep doing as much as we can to make people aware of the risks in what you and how you might want to invest and potentially, the different protections that do and don't exist between the APRA environment and self-managed super funds as well.
Yeah. And as ASIC said in that ABC story, it's important to just be aware of these things because they are seeing a bit of an increase with these sorts of things. The other big news we saw was with Prime Financial Group acquiring SMSF administration company Intello.
Yeah, so this Intello is based on the Gold Coast, and so this is obviously quite an interesting play for Prime. They have an administration business already within that business itself, so there's obviously quite a strategic opportunity there. I do know that there's some synergies, I guess, from a software point of view and those sorts of things. So there's naturally going to be there'd be an expectation that it'd be an accretive transaction, both in revenue and profitability there. So, it'd be interesting to kind of see where that heads to from here.
Yes. We're also seeing sort of a few changes and things happening in the loan space, which could be perhaps triggered a bit from the interest rates and the property market changing as well. I've heard that lenders and vendors are being a bit more particular about how documents are set up before they enter into a sale with a SMSF purchaser. Some of the vendors are asking for all the documents to be set up before they actually enter into that sort of sales process, which means that it sort of makes it difficult if you're planning to buy something off a whim You really need to be organised and prepared with all those kind of documents beforehand.
Yeah, so if you think about it in the context of LRBA, there are different rules naturally in every state. So some require the bare trust to be established before the contract is signed. Others, states, Victoria is a good example, you have the ability to prepare those at a later point in time after the contract's signed, and you've got the ability to execute nominations and so forth as well. So what we're seeing here is, I guess, policy within organisations as opposed to looking at the way the law works. So what I typically say to people, talk to professionals that might be ordering documents for us and so forth is, you need to understand not just what the law says, but understand what the provider that you're going to be using is actually telling you, because, there are instances where the provider will require you to use their bare trust deed, for example, as opposed to using a different supplier. There are requirements, as you kind of spoke about to David Basoli in your article, Miranda, where they are imposing a different set of requirements that appear different to what the law will allow. So I think it's a good example of, as you're going into these transactions with your client, be very clear on all of the stakeholders in this process as to whatever that transaction is, to be acutely aware of what needs to be done and when. And even where it means engaging with the auditor to ensure that if there's something that's outside the 9 dots, that again, you are quite clear and the auditor is comfortable in the position, so you're not coming up with any surprises sort of at the back end of the transaction, just as much as you might have at the very beginning.
Yes. You don't want it getting the process coming to a standstill and then sort of wasting money setting things up.
Yeah, and it's a frustration, isn't it, as well? So it's about, setting expectations with the clients, and then all of a sudden there's a whole heap of things that kind of tip over, which means the client experience can become problematic. It means that it might not settle in time. There might be costs in respect to those, so who then becomes responsible for them? So really getting clarity around what and how and when is critical to that process. And therefore, hopefully you can work through that process in a much more targeted and succinct fashion.
We also saw the ATO release their latest statistics for SMSFs. Most of it was sort of expected kind of things, but there was quite a significant increase with cryptocurrency assets. And they also updated the figure from the previous financial year as well, so the end of the 2021 financial year. So that's actually jumped up to 1 billion, which is quite a significant increase over 2 years.
So a billion or a trillion?
A billion. So it's still very small in terms of the overall amount. But yeah. So coming from a low base, obviously.
Yeah. So the growth. So you're right. So the growth is still obviously quite significant because, as you said, we're coming off a much lower base, and we've quite clearly seen some significant movement in what happened in cryptocurrency leading into that point in time. There's obviously been some corrections in more recent times. So it'll be interesting to kind of see the long-term trend in growth in cryptocurrency here, as much as it'd be to kind of see what happens in the, maybe the half year or annual peaks and stuff, because we will see a much, I guess, more representation of how active people are and a continued trend into these types of cryptocurrencies once we get data that gives us 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years into it, similar to what we've seen with the way in which property and NLRBAs has happened since it kind of kicked off in 2007.
Yes, it'll be interesting to see what sort of the trend does there.
Yep.
There's also been a few things happening on the political side of things. We've seen a franking credits proposal from Labor. I think it was around a month ago. They released some draft legislation on this. It's obviously a lot more limited than what it was to their previous franking credits policy, which was quite controversial back before the previous election.
Yep.
Yes, but yes, it still sort of seems to be stirring up a bit of criticism.
Yeah, so this is where, like you said, it's nowhere near to the extent of what they were previously discussing, but it is a very targeted approach whereby they don't intend on being able to allow for a company to pass through a fully franked dividend where it has been linked through to a capital raising process. So if we take Westpac, I know, for example, in the last financial year is one company. I think there might have been NAB as well. They went through a raise process, but then they ended up doing a buyback, which had a very large component of franking credits. So there's an element where the Treasurer is saying, oh, well, it's going to have very limited scope. But when you think about the types of companies, in particular institutions that have used this mechanism to go through things like buybacks and so forth, the key benefactors in this have been self-managed super funds, charitable institutions, those sorts of things. So it is going to have an impact on self-managed super funds, but nowhere near to the extent that it spoke about previously. So yeah, it's quite controversial, I guess, but like I said, not to the extent. Those that were quite vocal on it last time have kind of come out again. We know Jeff Wilson previously had raised a lot of this and kind of banded the whole, self-funded retiree segment together to really push back and in essence see Labor lose the unlosable election last time. But yeah, it will have an impact on the sector without any doubt. But yeah, we'll see how successful they end up being here, Labor, on trying to get this through. So at this stage, we're kind of waiting and seeing. But yeah, it will have a limitation, but I can see, and those two examples that I spoke about certainly showed the impact that it can have on self-managed super funds.
Yeah. And there's also two bills that sort of impact the retirement and SMSF sector in the Senate at the moment. So one of those is the downsizer, and that's already passed the House of Representatives, but it's still stuck in the Senate at the moment.
Yeah, so this is where we're seeing the further change in respect to the qualifying age for downsizer contributions going from age 60 down to age 55. So as you said, Miranda, we have seen that now go through the House of Representatives. It currently sits before the Senate. And once that does pass both houses and receives royal assent, it is intended to start from the quarter following once the Senate is received. So it's now not going to start any earlier than the 1st of January 2023.
And we've also got the bill for the Commonwealth Senior Health Card threshold increasing. So that's almost made its way through the Senate. So we've had the third reading agreed to in the Senate, but yes, it is still before the Senate, that one as well. So that will increase the threshold for that card, change some of the tests around that.
Yeah, so so qualifying here for singles will increase to $90,000 and for a couple $72,000 each or $144,000. So this was intended, I know the Centrelink and so forth, for those that were looking at or receiving payments, they were their websites had indicated that they're expecting all this to roll through from the 20th of September and the thresholds would apply. Naturally, we're past that date, but I suspect that once this applies, there may be a level of retrospectivity or something to it. I can't remember off the bill as it's sort of referenced, but there was a reference in the explanatory memorandum, I do recall, to that 20th of September date, which then matched into a lot of the literature that we do see online today.
Yes, so hopefully once it's passed, we get a bit more certainty around that as well.
Yeah.
We've also seen a bit more commentary coming out in terms of submissions with the Quality of Advice Review. And shortly, we're going to be speaking with Bryan Ashenden, Head of Financial Literacy and Advocacy from BT, who'll be sharing some of his thoughts about the review so far, but also sort of how it's been received in the advice community and some of the potential issues or predictions he has with the Quality of Advice review process. So we're now joined by Bryan Ashenden. Hi, Bryan. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Not a problem. Great to be here.
So we shortly saw, not too long ago, Michelle Levy and her team released the proposals paper as part of the Quality of Advice review. There have been some quite substantial proposals to make changes around the regulations for advice. What are some of your initial thoughts about those proposals?
Yeah, well, certainly, I mean, that proposals paper sort of contained those 12 proposals for reform. And obviously, the first thing we always have to remember is at this stage, they are just proposals. They're not even the final recommendations, if you like, that have come out and will be handed to government. But I do think they make for some really interesting reading and, I guess, contemplation about what the potential future for advice could look like. And definitely one of those proposals is Proposal 9, which, in essence says do away with the need for a statement of advice or a record of advice. I think that as a proposal, exactly how it'll look, we'll obviously need to wait and see. But as a proposal, I think that's a really, a real positive movement in the sense of, think about what the purpose of a statement of advice has always been, to convey from the advisor to the client or summarize, here's my recommendations for you from a strategy perspective, from a product perspective. But because of changes in legislation, because I guess a bit of a risk-adverse nature of many licensees and advisors, and and realistically also probably from the insurers coming in as well, the documents have just become so long, so unwieldy that they don't meet the corporation's law requirements themselves of being clear, concise, and effective. So I think that proposal about let's get rid of them, for many people is probably going to be that's a fantastic thing if we could achieve it. Mm-hmm. I would say, however, we're probably going to slightly, really think about it in the sense of, yes, maybe we do away with the formal statement of advice, but I don't think we would, probably be in a position, and perhaps we wouldn't want to be in a position where it's the complete absence of any form of documentation being provided to the client. And I sort of say that thinking, if you're a client, you're coming in, you're seeing an advisor, I'm sure you want to walk away with something that summarizes what those recommendations are. So I think that there will still be something, but, getting rid of some of that formality and all of those onerous requirements that currently exist under the law, I think will at least allow some flexibility to come in, maybe a little bit more of innovation about how do you actually deliver that document. So, is it, does it make it easier to say I'm actually delivering it via a PowerPoint or I'm, whatever that method is, might still be an actual Word, sort of document printed out and handed over, but at least I think there'll be more flexibility. And I'm sure many advisors and licensees will be crying out for that as, at least the minimum type of change to come through.
And Bryan, this comes back to the whole balance between having a document that is comfortable and is valuable, obviously, to the client, to what you said before around the fact that it's, a statement of advice has grown into something that kind of serves the licensee from a protection point of view, but doesn't really serve the purpose of the client that's actually seeking the advice in the first instance. And I know from the proposals paper that went out, there's been very positive feedback, I guess, from within the industry, but you've also seen consumer groups also raising some concerns. So there is a fairly big challenge in here to find the right balance by Michelle and her team.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the other bit to bear in mind is even though we might not have that statement of advice, and again, we're sort of saying, big picture, that's what we'd love to achieve. We've got to remember, though, we're still not getting rid of the consumer protections that exist for clients. And I think that's part of it. I mean, the statement of advice sets out what a lot of those are. Statements of advice is what, you point to go, well, what did you tell me we were going to do and how well have we done it? And that's where I still say, I think we'll have something, but it's surely it's going to be a lot shorter. It's going to be a lot more succinct. It's really just going to summarize what are those key things that we're looking at. And that's part of, the concerns that might, do come up from the consumer groups. Again, we've got to think about it's also about the way that we deliver things. And when they talk about, one of the other proposals was about getting rid of the need to hand over a fee as a financial services guide, like physically hand one over or physically email it out, and point to the client, to the advisor's website if you've got the information there. And, again, realistically, that means it's going to be more current at all times for all clients.
Right. Yep.
And you have, again, a lot of that information about what's your right as a client, as a consumer, will be sitting there. Mm-hmm. So we're not getting rid of these things, but it's just part of the changing world about we've got to work out what that right balance is to sort of achieve it so that clients can get that advice, and it will be more affordable if we're not so worried about producing this really long, complex document. That's just one of those things that's going to help, I think, cut out a lot of those costs. And we've got to look at what those benefits are, but still provide the right level of protection.
And it's relying on the skills of the professional, right? It's saying my knowledge is in ensuring that there's the right retirement advice, contributions advice, pensions advice, whatever it is. And that's the core of what the client wants to hear, not all the other potential bits that kind of fall within, the requirements of what an SOA contains at the moment.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a really good balance that these proposals, at least to me, they feel like they've struck. And that's actually recognising where financial advice and financial advisors are today. We have absolutely seen that uplift in professionalism. We've got the professional standards, we've got the CPD requirements, we've got codes of ethics that are in place. Those couple of things themselves, but I think just overall, the way you certainly see that advisors as a collective now conduct themselves, the processes they go through, there is no doubt in my mind that advisors are much more professional today. They are viewed as much more professional, and therefore we should rely on that professionalism, that approach, to say that we know advisors these days, they are doing the right thing by their clients. We're not trying to cut any corners or do anything else of that sort. And we should be able to take that into account in terms of what our regulatory regime actually looks like going forward.
So you've mentioned that that proposal around SOAs has been received quite positively. What's been some of the other sort of reactions for some of the other proposals in the paper?
Well, I think one of the other ones, which is, again, it's probably one of those ones that gets a little bit of the mixed response, I would say, comes back, and it's probably the combination that you get out of proposal 1 and 2 and when you sort of flow those through. And so proposal 1 is the one that's essentially saying we're going to change the definition of what constitutes personal advice. And by changing that definition, we actually get rid of or we do away with the need to have a definition of general advice. And so it sort of puts us in this position. It says it's either advice or it's not. And if it's advice, basically it's personal advice. Now, it's interesting because it's, the way that it was proposed to be defined is similar to our existing personal advice definition, that you've got you're making a recommendation or you're providing an opinion about something. But it basically says, as long as you're making that recommendation or opinion about a financial product or about a class of financial product, and you hold information about the client. So that information about their objectives, their needs, their financial situation. If you hold that information and you're making that, those comments around a financial product or a class of product, then it's deemed to be personal advice. So it's not, have you taken that into account in forming your recommendation? It's just you hold that information. Now, again, that's sort of good in one sense because it says it just gets rid of that blur between personal versus general. But it runs probably the risk that there are times when we want to be saying things, we want to be doing things with clients that should not be regarded as being personal advice, but under this new definition potentially do fall, within that scope, just because we hold the information. And I think, an example might be, if an advisor was to send out a newsletter to their clients, and, part of good practice, that's what a lot of advisors do. They'll send out a regular newsletter, contains information. And what if that newsletter contained information that said, whether it's been sourced from a third-party provider or whatever it is, but let's just say, and at the moment, the view from, this research provider is that this particular stock, is good value. So, it's a good stock to hold on to. Now, the advisor in that sense is the one is not really providing the recommendation. They're just passing it on, but they hold information on the client. Now, they may not actually be talking to that client about investing into stocks, but they hold information about the client. They've provided a comment that talks about a financial product. Is it personal advice? And so is it therefore captured? Now, you sort of move on. You go, well, we don't have to provide an SOA, so we don't have all of those other compliance requirements that sort of come in. But it's still the question about everything that I say or do with an existing client. Does that mean it's going to become personal advice? So yes, it makes things a little bit simpler in terms of the definitional aspect of it, but we've still got complications that would need to be worked through to exactly how does it work, what gets captured. And I use that marketing example as just a sort of an illustration about the things that still need to be looked at, still need to be addressed as part of the process.
Yeah, so still a few big questions with things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how easy or difficult, and I mean, you use that one as, I guess, a challenge, but how difficult or easy do you think it'll be to implement some of these proposals into law?
Well, I think that's ultimately going to be the big question. It's not going to be easy, I think is the simple answer. And I think that's the bit that when people say, well, when are we going to see these sort of changes come through? It's going to take a while, I think, for the appropriate legislation to be drafted. We've also got to bear in mind that the Australian Law Reform Commission is currently doing a review of financial services law and, looking to try and simplify things. So you've sort of got to fold the two things together. So it's not going to be simple, but we also need to remember that what, Michelle Levy was sort of talking about is very much going on a principles-based approach. So if you're going on a principles-based approach, you arguably don't need as much complex legislation in there. It's about, we know what the intent is. We're operating in line with that intent. And we might have some other regulatory guidance there that's there to assist us, but
there's conduct and discipline and stuff. There's measures there that help oversee what that profession looks like.
Yeah, exactly. And it's, it's like all of these things. It's going to take time for people to get used to what it looks like and work out, how do you navigate through it and actually get comfortable. So I think it's going to take a bit of time, and it will feel challenging at first. There's no doubt about that. But again, I think, we've got to think about what's the intent out of these proposals. And, what do we want to achieve? I mean, at the end of the day, we want more people to be able to have access to advice that is actually affordable for them.
The interesting thing I find out of this is, and we spoke a little bit before about reactions of advisors, the challenge that they're going to go through from working in an environment that's been so prescriptive for so long into a more principles-based approach and relying upon the professionalism that is trying to underpin, this as a profession now. Do you think practitioners are going to kind of find that a bit challenging themselves? And, are they going to be reliant somewhat on, or have they become reliant upon the fact that the prescriptive thing just says, well, it's black and it's white, and therefore that ideal in black and ideal in white, and that's it. Whereas this will give them elements of grey and different shades of grey to obviously work through based upon, client scenarios.
Yeah, look, it's no doubt. I think for many, it's going to be it would be a huge shift. There's definitely a lot that enjoy the, whilst not always the case, but the largely black and white nature, of prescriptive legislation. But it's also not new, because let's remember, we've had a code of ethics in place for over 2 years now. And the code of ethics is 12 principles. When you look at the standards, they are principles based.
Yep.
So again, and we've seen people struggle initially when it was introduced, go, well, what do they actually mean? What are they trying to focus on when they talk about this standard? And I think we've now seen that people have over time become more accepting and have that understanding about, well, what is the intent? And I think that's the same thing you're going to face here. There will be difficulties at first, trying to navigate and go, well, what are the edges where I can't go too far, but I know I've then got the sort of the freedom in between those as to how I want to do it. So again, it'll take a little bit of time, but I do think the fact that we will have had, it's been 2 years now, and who knows how many years before we see this actual, legislative change out of this, but there will have been time for advisors to become much more used to operating in a principles-based environment and have an understanding about how that actually operates. And again, this is what it does. It to a very large extent, like the code of ethics, it is coming back saying you're a professional. As an advisor, you use your professional judgment as to what is required, through these sort of situations.
That to me is it's going to be quite interesting, because it's kind of like, in using swimming parlance for a second, you can only swim freestyle and you have to swim in that direction. Whereas it's going to move to, well, you can swim, and as long as you swim between the flags, right? And how you swim and how you get there, you use your own professional judgment to ultimately achieve that outcome. So, yeah, very good insight.
Yeah, absolutely.
So while we're on the topic of advice regulation, the other big thing that sort of happened recently is the government's been consulting on the experience pathway for the education requirements. How do you sort of see that playing out once the consultation finishes and they sort of progress with the legislation with that?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting one. And it's, it's interesting in the sense that the government's proposal essentially was to say if you've got at least 10 years worth of experience, now they've given a 15-year time frame that they said you needed to get that experience within, but let's put that time frame piece aside for a moment. They were saying if you've got 10 years worth of experience and you've got a clean compliance record, then basically you've met the education requirements. You don't have to do anything more. Now, the interesting piece, and certainly this is one that comes up quite consistently in discussions with advisors, is everybody, I think, agrees that we should have a greater level of recognition for experience. We've got, many great advisors that have been involved in providing financial advice to their clients for an extended period of time, and we need to recognize that experience. But on the same hand, I think there's actually quite a strong view from the majority of advisors saying a complete exemption from education is not the right answer. That there probably needs to be something. Now, what that something is probably the big question. Is it, well, you at least still just need to do the code of ethics subject? Is it that one as an example? I know there's been a few submissions talking about, well, what if you're a member of a professional association that has a code of ethics in place, that you might have done, certain qualifications through that organisation? Should that be sufficient as well? So there's all these, what ifs, but I think the general view seems to be, let's recognise experience because it's important and we don't want to lose experience. But, that move to professionalism, one of the key moves and key characteristics of moving to a profession is having higher education standards. So, again, I think the majority of advisors, and obviously it's not all, but the majority of advisors still feel like there should be something. Whether that's a little bit of a, well, I already got on with it and I did some education and I would have got the experience pathway if I had known about it, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, then, I would have waited. So because I've gone off and done it, then surely everyone else should have to. So there's a little bit of that. But again, I think it's that, view, people thinking, if we want to be regarded as a profession, then you probably shouldn't just have an automatic exemption. There must be something else that you probably need to do. And it's just a question of what that is.
Well, you're a man that wears many hats, Bryan. So obviously through BT, with all the financial literacy and advocacy work you do in your role as a board member on the SMSF Association, I guess, from the discussions we've had today, is there any other, messages, comments and stuff that you'd like to make on these particular topics?
Look, I think the overall comment, realistically, I think we have to say is that the future, it does look positive. I think there are some collectively, both from a government perspective, from, various industry associations, I think even, from advisors and even clients, the future for advice really does look positive. And, I think one of the key things we've just got to make sure is, we collectively need to try and work together from all different angles, all different participants in this space. We've got to try and make sure we work together and work together much better to see all of these benefits actually come through. And for me, I think that's just going to be one of those key things that we all need to work towards. We can't get caught up in the minutiae of some things that, have the potential to sidetrack us or to really delay things. It's like, let's just try and work together and, let's take the same approach, saying, what are the principles that we're trying to achieve and how do we make sure that we can? And I think that's, to me, the big key thing from all different aspects. It's, there's a real positive future. There's more people, in this tough economic environment that need advice. And so if we can find ways to make it easier for them to get it and to be able to afford it, we know there's plenty of studies that say that if you get advice, it actually does really add value at the end of the day. So how do we just make it, possible for more people to get that advice?
Well, thank you so much for sharing all your thoughts on those latest developments. You've been very insightful as always, Bryan.
No worries. Thanks, Miranda. Thanks, Aaron. It's been great to be with you.
Excellent. Thanks, Bryan. We'll catch up. See you at the SMSF Technical Day events.
All right. Thanks.
So, Miranda, always insightful is Bryan, and in particular, certainly when we look at the proposals paper from the Quality of Advice Review, what was the key takeaway for you from our discussion today with him?
I guess just the fact there are still a lot of those issues to be worked out. And obviously the proposals are really aiming at making everything simpler and fixing all those kind of complex issues, which is great, obviously, but there will still be kind of those grey areas and issues that crop up that will have to be sort of figured out along the way.
Yeah, and I guess it's a step along the journey, isn't it? Ultimately, it's kind of, we've seen this initial paper, we've seen a lot of discussion in a positive sense, in a negative sense, if we think about some of the consumer responses we've seen to it and the protections that are in play. And, I always go back, and I think we've probably touched on this in previous SMSF advisor shows as well. It's, the best change is going to come from a uniform approach. So we talk about consistency in view across professional bodies. Bryan did speak about that, obviously, and the fact that the way in which, if we have a consumer focus with a uniform approach in respect to how the industry goes to move forward, I think the government is going to listen more than obviously where there are competing demands from within a particular sector. And I know the additional podcast we shared with Stuart Robert also kind of, there was that sort of tone that he had in there, that there was a whole sort of mishmash of feedback and there wasn't really any consistency in some stuff, which is kind of why we got to where we got to now. So recognising those things, we hope to see, positive steps forward, but it is one step in a fairly long journey that we're going to have to go through. So you get the sense that this is a bit more of a marathon than a sprint, right? So there are a lot of stages that we're going to have to go through, whether that be from the final report and then obviously it becoming law, and the fact that we will see negotiation, whether it's in the Senate and all those things. So I think, there's a lot more water to go under the bridge, but there's a positive sense, and Bryan really, you could see that come through, I guess, in his final messages, that this is the way forward, and it provides some great opportunities for the profession in providing advice to consumers, which is ultimately what it's all about.
I also thought it was interesting what both you and Bryan mentioned about it being quite a significant shift as advisors have been they've gotten so used to this prescriptive kind of law, and now they're shifting to one where they'll be making more professional judgment. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes as well.
Yeah, and that's it's the whole transition to a profession, right? You are being judged on being at a professionalism and the professional standards that come with it. So, and that applies in any profession. So it is that move to professionalism for the industry and it's gone through significant change over the last 4 or 5 years. And there is going to be further change that comes with that. So it's the adaptation to change that will really drive the success of what that professionalism looks like into the future. So Miranda, as is always the way with our SMSF Advisors show, if anyone who is listening would like to find out more about different topics, speakers that you'd like to hear from, how can they get in contact with us?
So they can get in touch at editor@smsfadvisoronline.com.au, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Excellent. Well, thank you once again for joining us for the SMSF Advisor show. Take care and bye for now.
Interest rates are rising fast, and that means higher mortgage repayments. But some lenders have increased their rates more than others, so that could mean your clients are now paying too much for their loan. We can quickly compare your client's rate with hundreds of similar loans, so you are confident that you've got the best rate on the market, or we'll find you a better rate. Make sure your clients aren't paying the highest interest rates. Call Finny today. Visit finny.com.au and let us take the research and admin out of finding a new rate for your clients.